waste our time, so we will go directly to our lecture. Yesterday, we had a plenary about on our design. Okay, so it's a subdivision, and well, I mentioned there that the lot was actually taken from your exercise na inside selection. And I think it's in group 4 where we were able to choose the lot. And I hope that you were able to look it up already in Google Earth or Google Map, and then initial made an initial assessment. But what I'm going to present now is also what I presented in my design class after that plenary meeting, and which is about the, well, I entitled it Horizontal and Vertical Development Guidelines, but it applies more for horizontal development. Um, okay, so in the slides, you can see there are four types of housing, depending on the cost of the house, okay, of the house being built. So on the lowest rank is the socialized housing, 450,000 pesos and below is the cost of the house. Then the economic housing, um, for horizontal development at least, no, it's 450 to 1 million, 1.7 million, and then 1.7 to 4 million for medium cost, and open market housing is 4 million above. Okay, so there are subdivisions that actually tell you to design a house worth more than 4 million because they wanted it to be a high-end subdivision. So they don't want the environment to be mixed up with some, I don't know how they call it, no? Maybe substandard design or substandard structure. So image is really very important to that subdivision developer. On the other hand, on the extreme side, socialized housing is mostly used because there is a law that says, which I mentioned there in the during the briefing, that whenever a developer what has this project, I'm sorry, so I have a text, important text. Um, well, whenever there's a project for a subdivision, so the developer, if the lot is more than 1 hectare, they're required to sort of donate uh, 20% to socialized housing. Okay, so that's how our government tries to solve the problem of housing here in the Philippines. They're sort of partnering. We call it partner. They call it partnering with the private sector. But aside from that, they also have their government-led housing projects. Okay. Um, the thing here, what I wanted to emphasize is that the standards are different for the first two here in the left and the other half, no? So socialized and economic housing are covered by a law called BP 220, okay, the Socialized Housing Act, Batasang Pambansa, no, 220. So that is something that you should really memorize. It comes out in the board exam, and it comes out every now and then in our in projects. On the other hand, there's that medium cost housing and open market housing, which includes condominiums. Okay, so not only subdivision. So it's a subdivision and condominium law that regulates it. It is called the PD 957, so Presidential Decree 957. So the basis of price ceiling that you see here are just basis for price ceiling. They're not really the law that regulates them. No? Um, it's not important for us. On in hindsight, I should have placed here the laws that regulate the two. So I'll do that before I share the slides with you. Okay, so how do you know? How would you know that the house you're designing would actually cost so much. So in Facebook, so I was able to get this. Um, so in Facebook, there's a lot of people who have so restless. They wanted to share information, regardless if it's already pro bono. So, but then it also benefits us. Okay, so if you're going to build something bare, so that's 15,000 per square meter. And standard, you have tiles, you have paint, that's nothing luxurious, so 25,000. And then if you have some luxurious, but this is not even luxury per se, because you can even go much, much higher. So this is like a basic luxury. So that's 35,000 per square meter. So therefore, in your plate, and by the way, going back here, I don't know whether your instructor in design already discussed this with you, but in my briefing, I mentioned in the background that the developer is planning to put up an open market housing or subdivision, so which is this about 4 million. Okay, but then when I was presenting it, the our coordinator's architect Presas, she used a the title of the plate as medium and how subdivision. So which gives you the idea that it might be medium cost housing. So I already pointed that out to them, and actually they, after a while, we agreed that it should be open market housing. Okay. So just in case it's not clear with your instructor, so please clarify it with them because the instructor might prefer medium cost housing. In any case, it will help you to know that the house that you're designing will actually qualify for open market or medium cost if you are able to estimate using the per square meter method. Okay, so you design a house, so you already know how many square meters times say 35,000. So how much will it cost? Of course, the houses we're designing is two-story, so that's times two or something like plus second story. Okay, so that's how to go about it. Okay. Now, in terms of project location, it's the same. It's the same criteria for all types of housing. It has to be suitable for housing outside potential hazard, prone and prone areas and protection areas. Okay, so this is not a problem because that site went through site selection thanks to you guys. No? And then land allocation for projects for 1 hectare and above. So we have I mentioned that there should be, for your plate, it should be 70% saleable and 30% non-saleable. So for the non-saleable, one part of that will be devoted to parks and playgrounds. Okay, so I think I mentioned there that parks and playgrounds is really required. Okay, so but then how much of that at least should be devoted to parks and playgrounds? So you have here, depending on the density of the number of lots per hectare. Now you might ask, um, but for some of you who are under me in design, so this is the second time that you you hear this, no? But then I'm actually going to explain this more, elaborate more today. You might ask, how do I know the density of my lot? So you have the 1 hectare divided by, it's not really 1 hectare, it's 10,700 something. So 1 hectare divided by, um, or we get the 70% of 1 hectare, so that's 700,000. Um, I mean, that's 7,000 square meters. And then divide that into chunks. No, 40% of that for how's that? 40% for the single detached, 30% for um, the or 2,100 square meters for the row house, and 2,100 for duplex and single attached. Okay. Now, so 2,100 for row house, 2,100 for um, single attached duplex, and like 2,800 square meters for the single attached. Okay. Um, we have here later the um, minimum area for each of these: single attached, single detached, and row house. So you divide that area, say 2,800 square meter, divided by the minimum area for each lot for single detached. So you get so many number of lots, okay? And we do the same with the others, and then you add up all up, and then if it comes to 20 and below, so therefore, you only need to uh, provide 3.5% of the for the parks and playground. But this 3.5% is not the 3.5% of the 30%. It's the 3.5% of the whole lot of the 1 hectare. Okay, so just in case, because otherwise it will really be very small. No? For community facilities, okay, so um, we're required here to put up a multi-purpose center for housing projects with area 1 hectare and above. Okay, so it's not a chapel; it's just a space for to be used for anything, basically multi-purpose. Okay, um, but it can be used as a chapel when there's a mass. But then it can also be used later on for meeting area, assembly, training, etc. Okay, so normally a subdivision, especially if it's a high end like your plate, um, the owner of the land, who might not be the developer, so might be in partner with the developer, and then after everything is sold to all the buyers, um, they form what we call a homeowners association. And so they actually set that up as a corporation. They set it up with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then they have a set of officers. And this time it's the homeowners association that sort of manages the whole subdivision, that decides on the parameters, no? And sometimes the owner or the developer or both, if they want to still be in control, so they want to have the uh, like the majority shares of that corporation, so that when it comes to crucial decisions, so they can have really the say, no? That they can still control it. Which means that they might buy some of the uh, houses for themselves, that so they will be considered as the owners, and end up renting them out so that they can still uh, earn. So these are some of the um, arrangements. The reason why I said that is because these facilities, which are common facilities supposedly, will be managed by the homeowners association. Okay, so it might well, it normally a homeowners association does not have an office if it's a very simple subdivision, maybe medium cost or economic. But when it comes to an open market housing, I think they will have an office because people are more demanding, and then there will be a lot of requirements. So it's more, it's they might even end up hiring staff. So when you build a neighborhood multipurpose center, so little office is expected in that facility. So these are non-saleable. And depending on how generous you are, for example, you're only required 3.5% for open space and parks and playgrounds, and then there's still a lot a lot more open space after even deducting the roads, because somehow you design it very efficiently. So you can still put more um, facilities. So you can add a chapel maybe, or you can even increase the parks and playgrounds. But then, if I mentioned this yesterday, if you choose to add more commercial facilities, so that's also okay. But these are saleable. Saleable, that counts for the 70%. Okay. So if you in your plate decides to put up a commercial space, so you deduct that from the you get that from the 70%, but then so the rest of the area is that what you divide according to the housing units. Still, the ratio should be 40, 30, 30. Okay, 40% for the um, 40% for the single detached. So I could never anyway, single detached. Mm, so these are for circulation systems. So our project is 2.5 hectares and below, and it's also open market housing. So we can have major roads with 10-meter road right of way, and minor roads which are 8 meters. Okay. Now, next meeting, we will be discussing more about the circulation system. So I'll be teaching you how to design with all these major roads, minor roads, and alleys and fast walk and motor courts. Okay. But this right of way or the road right of way actually means that space between one property to the next, the space allotted for the road and everything else. So everything else includes the planter and also or the plant strip and also the sidewalk. So the road proper for the car is called the carriageway. And you see that here below. No? Carriageway is 5 meters given a road right of way of 6 meters. So therefore, the remaining 1 meter is devoted um, for the sidewalk. So you have half a meter sidewalk on each side. So of course, there's the priority. The sidewalk comes in as a priority than the planting strip. Okay. So here's what I mean. There's a minimum lot area for each type of housing, and depending on the class of housing. For single detached, it's 120 square meters. And then for duplex or single attached, it's 96 square meters for open market. And then no house is 60 square meters. Um, there are some notes here, but you can just read them later. No? And here we have a frontage also. So it's not enough that the you have the right area, but then the front is regulated. And for single detached, it depends on the type of lot. You have a corner lot, regular, and interior lot. The common one is, of course, the regular lot where you have on the one side facing the road, and then at the both side and also at the rear maybe other properties. Okay, in which case it's 10 meters in frontage for those for medium cost and open market housing. Now, I also recall an important uh, note, no, for regarding the design of subdivision. You see, the owners really you have a lot of type of character when it comes to design. No? You will meet a lot of owners which are really very hard-headed. They have all the money in the world, or may not maybe in the world, but at least they have a lot of money. They wanted to come out with a something like medium cost housing subdivision because it makes them feel good maybe. But then they want to apply the standards for socialized and economic housing, which are smaller, if you see here. No, so he wants it medium cost, and then he wants the every lots to be like 72 square meters only. So this is something that we should educate the owners about. And because well, it becomes problematic when we assist them in getting permits from HLURB, or I think it's now the Human Settlement um, Housing Land Use. It used to be Housing Land Use and Regulatory Board. Anyway, when we get the approvals, no, to build the subdivision. So if you notice, row house is only 4 meters. So it's really a challenge to design a row house outside the typical designs, because I don't know whether the design of a row house has been fully exhausted. No? So a block, since you're going to arrange them into blocks, no, with a road all around that block, so the maximum length is 400 meters. But then if the block exceeds 250 meters, so there should be an alley in between. So therefore, if your block is 450 meters, 400 meters, so there should be an alley in between. But if it is less than 250, so you only design to something like 245 meters in length. So meters. If I say square meters, so no, please correct that, no. So 250 meters in length. If less than that, so there's no need to put an alley in between. So the alley is 2 meters, no, like mentioned earlier. Like mentioned here. Okay. Actually, I think this is the same slide that I showed earlier. Okay, so this does not apply to us in our plate, but then if, for example, there are two public roads which are parallel, so Road A and Road B, and in between there are a lot of subdivisions being made, and then they decided to buy a property which they will use as access road, um, and then to connect to the public road. So initially, supposedly that's a private road, but then when the whole thing is finished, they can donate it to the government so that it becomes a public road. So once it becomes a public road, it will now be the responsibility of the government to develop the road, to cement it, to put drainage and utilities, and also to maintain it. Otherwise, that responsibility falls on the supposedly owner of the lot. Since you're going to design the gate, um, you have to consider a shoulder for the cars like this in the entry. The minimum dimension is given here. So this is like just a driveway for the jeeps and also for cars, dropping off some people if they're not entering the subdivision. The subdivision projects will have provisions for future expansion where applicable by designating minimum interconnecting road right of way of 10 meters. Okay. Um, in the property that we will be using um, the site recommended by the students, the group of students, actually is like 2 hectares. But then we decided to use only the 1 hectare, the lower half. So there's actually the other half which can be used for extension. So it's up to you if you provide um, a road that goes there but ends up um, as a dead end for now because it can be used for extension, or you or it's okay also if you don't need to do that, since that lot is also accessible to the barangay road. So the extension could be another subdivision with another entrance. Okay. So I will discuss more about the medium cost and open market housing because it is related to your plate, and then um, uh, basically you can read up the rest, no, about socialized housing, economic housing. I'll just point out something which might come out very important. Okay, so these are the types of roads that you will be dealing with depending on the class of housing that you will design. Okay. Um, so again, for 2.5 hectares and below, we have a major road, a minor road, a motor court, and alley. Otherwise, we have collectors. And again, we will be dealing with that more later in our next lecture about circulation. So this is what I mean. PS means planting strip and SW means sidewalk. So how much planting strip and sidewalk to give, and so the remainder is for the carriageway. So depending on the type of the width of the road, you see here at the left. Um, Earlier we say that our major road is 10 meters and the minor road is 8 meters. So for 10 meters, okay, we provide zero point 0.8 meters for planting strip, which is zero point 0.4 in each side, and then 1.2 meter for sidewalk, which means zero point 0.6 in each side. Now, please, I just remembered something. Please bear in mind that these are minimum, okay? Now, in the Philippines, at least the um, government is really frustrating, okay? Especially if there are people who are supposed to be doing technical things, but they are not trained for it, especially the DPWH. If you know anyone uh, close to you who are working in DPWH, so I'm sorry uh, if, if some of my comments would hurt. Because, for example, when we complain that, okay, so this is such a big development, how is it that the sidewalk is only 60 centimeters on each side? And the reply is always because that is the minimum given by the code. Okay? Yeah, it's a minimum, but when it becomes a big development, you can also actually make your sidewalks bigger or your road wider in proportion to the development because there will be more people using it. Okay, so minimum is not maximum. Okay, in the Philippines, it's like minimum is the maximum, and then the minimum is actually like the makaluluoy portion of the humanitarian portion of the practice. So that is not correct. Okay, the minimum is the humanitarian portion of the practice already. So we're allowing it to be this small, but still comfortable to everyone. Because otherwise, it is not comfortable. It is even detrimental. Okay. Okay, so there's no problem here with road pavement. It's either concrete or asphalt for medium cost and open market. Okay, so we will have a special lecture about um, utilities in a subdivision. Okay, um, you might be wondering why are we talking about subdivision? Is it only because it's our plate? No. The coverage of planning one is site planning, and then the site planning is not only one house in one site. No, it's one site with the development inside, okay, and which is private. And this one site for subdivision is such a case, no? So it's a development which is private, and it could also be a commercial development. But since your plate is more on subdivision, so we're applying this on that subdivision, but the principles here apply only to some of them apply to commercial developments, okay? Because of course the type of houses are not part of a commercial development. But the utilities part and also the circulation and open system apply to even commercial and industrial complexes. So we will not discuss this now, but at least to let you know that there is also regulate regulations for water supply, how many liters per capita per day per household connection, for example. So therefore, you will have to provide for a water tank, and then for fire protection, what is required by the Fire Code of the Philippines? Do they require um, fire hydrants inside a subdivision, or how is that? No. So and also electrical power supply. So it's the same for all of this. No. So you will have your electrical poles, and then drainage systems also the provisions of septic tank. No. Um, anyway, we'll deal this more on that special lecture, including sewage disposal and garbage disposal. So this is something that I also tried to emphasize yesterday in my class, the design. Uh, because someone asked about what are the spaces inside the house. Is it something that they should research on or no? And the reply was yes, it should be something that should part of your research since you already been through designs of houses in since third year last semester. So you should know by now how what are the spaces inside the house. But in a subdivision, especially in a high-end subdivision or open market housing, homeowners association usually requires a garbage bin which is accessible from the street. Okay, so that they might have their own garbage collection system, their own garbage truck, or they might ask the barangay to come in at a particular schedule and collect, and it should be smooth as possible. Okay, um, it, um, to tell you, some of you might be living in a high-end subdivision, no, but for those who are not, it's really like sometimes almost irritating how they want everything so spick and span, no, so clean. To the point that okay, it has to be like this so that we do not see any garbage around. Okay, so but that's also okay. In fact, it's better. But it's more like mabusisi, you know. Um, for shelter components, we have minimum floor areas. Earlier, we talked about minimum lot areas, but for the housing, well, the house itself, the minimum floor area is here, 42 square meters. Let's see. Um, 42 times 35,000 is under 40,000. So it's not enough, no? Um, you have to make it bigger. Anyway, it's up to you. You can defend it by saying, okay, my house costs something like 50,000 per square meter to build. Okay, to get away with it. No? Okay, so the firewall is something that you should also, I think the National Building Code is discussed in professional practice, if I'm not wrong, but just in case. So whenever the house or the part of the house go beyond the setback or encroach the setback, so it's better to just go all the way to the property and put up a firewall. Okay. Now, in a row house, you cannot avoid it because you really have the firewall on both sides. Okay. So this is like the row house that you see here. And then there are regulations on how far the firewall extends along the walls and on top of the roof. So it's 30 centimeters. Okay, minimum level of completion has something to do with the actual practice, no? That you cannot You cannot sell this if it's not completed. Complete the house is not completed. But then if it's an economic housing, okay, so you can have on the shell for socialized or a complete house for economic. Setbacks and easement, it says here for medium cost to refer to the National Building Code. Now, here in the socialized housing, the frontage is only 1.5 meters, okay, and economic housing. So this is where most of the subdivision owners or developers would try to cheat, okay. They're trying to sell all their housing into, I don't know, they try to sell it very big, but then when they design like on the minimum um, with minimum setbacks for socialized and economic. Okay, because this is very small. For single detached house, the front is 4.5. Okay, and then the side is always 2 meters. Here is 1.5, and then 2.0. Abutments refer to projections, no? From the main walls of the building, something projects outside, and then they can be allowed. What are these projections? Like the roof eaves, okay? So you have the wall here, which is 2 meters away from the property line, but then your roof extends and encroaches the setbacks. That is allowed because abutments are not supposed to be enclosed rooms. Okay, so even a balcony is allowed because it's not an enclosed room. For carport, even just the roof is not an enclosed room unless you enclose the whole thing. So, but then even the the carport, as we shall see later, will have to have firewall. Okay, so this is the minimum setbacks for residential building structures. Okay, so for the houses that we're designing for the subdivisions are considered as R1. Okay. After this slide is the definitions for each of these R1, R2, R3, R5. So the front is 4.5, side is 2 meters, and rear is 2 meters. Okay. So there are so many notes here, but I leave it to you to read them. They should be very simple to understand. But if you don't understand them, you can ask me later what you don't understand. No? So R1 are low density residential zones characterized mainly by single family, single detached dwellings, the usual community ancillary uses on a neighborhood scale, such as executive subdivisions, which we are doing, and relatively exclusive residential communities, which are not subdivisions. Okay. What are these relatively exclusive residential communities which are not subdivisions? So it's just a like an organic subdivision. No? So they were formed there because lot owners were buying and then building houses, but then they there's no uh, higher entity. There's no company that actually organized that. No, they just voluntarily bought some properties. Okay, and then there was no really development of a subdivision. But later on, they already since there are a lot of houses, they already form sort of a community, but they're not bound by any homeowners association. So they're directly bound by the barangay. Okay. Now R2 are like some apartments, and then R3 our plate first plate is actually an R4, but it was a problematic R4 because R4 is either less than 3 or well R4 should be more than 4, I think 5 stories, but then when we were trying to categorize it, it falls more on R4 than R5. R5 are already your high-rise condominiums. Okay, so just read on this to be more familiar with the categorization. So I mentioned earlier about the lot types. There's a corner lot, interior, regular, and I think an end lot earlier, no? So corner through lot is something which is rare, okay? So normally this is avoided by planners, but sometimes I don't know it still exists. So corner through lot has like road on all three sides. An end lot is property at the end of a road. Normally the opening is very narrow. Um, a through lot is a lot with a street on both front and then back. And then a corner lot, of course, is in the corner. Uh, Number seven here is supposed to be the regular lot. And then interior lot or supposedly inside lot. No? So the terminologies uh, are confusing. But this is supposed to be regular lot with one side opening a street. And then this one is when this is not a good um, graphic because interior lot is supposed to be accessible only by this right of way. So there is a property in front of that their own property before the street, no? Therefore, the only way to access the street is to buy a part of that property as their own road, which is the right of way. Okay, so that's the plight of an interior lot. But as mentioned earlier in the law, this is how they define also inside lot. So let's go back to that. Okay, where are you? Here. Ah, yeah, interior lot they gyapon, no? So it's not an inside lot. So so the inside lot and the regular lot are the one that is interchangeable. So interior lot. So nakuan ko ato. I got confused. Okay. So these ones are based on the National Building Code, but then the graphics are done by someone else outside. So it's not an official graphic. But at least they try to do it this way so it's easier to understand when we talk about the setbacks and we talk about the because in the National Building Code you will encounter a lot of terms like AMBF, allowable maximum building footprint. Okay, so I will just show this to you in passing. This is for a uh, single detached, so you have done the single attached. There are two ways, and then you also have the row house type 4 meters. And then even a single attached is actually can be expanded to include the whole property, no, the whole side of the property, so that you only have the rear setback and the front setback, and then you have firewalls on both sides. Um, so here, let's read over the ones in red. Firewalls allowed at podium component only. So if you have a like high rise, a high rise normally has a podium like the first 2 or 3 floors, first few floors, and then the rest of the building go up. Okay, so only the podium can have firewall, not the whole building all the way to 15 floors with a firewall. So that's not allowed. Firewall allowed at podium. Okay, basement wall must not be along the property line. So apply setback. So even the basement wall should have setbacks. So here are more graphics that shows the standards. No, um, If you notice here, in socialized housing, we mentioned that the setback on the side is 1.5 meter, but then there are abutments. But what is essential is you can extend as far back, as far away from the building, as long as the distance between your abutment and the neighbor's abutment is 1.5 meter. So to make it equal, so you can only extend not more than 0.75 meter from the from your property line. Okay, which means you can only extend 75 meters, centimeters away from your wall, which is the one here. Okay, this is how a duplex would look like. If this other half is actually facing that way, the same as this, so it's now called a single attached. So this is how a row house would look like, because after, there was someone who was asking what it means. But please note that in your plate, you're supposed to design a two-story row house. Everything is two-story. Socialized housing. Okay, so we have the same types of restrictions. And here are some restrictions about the firewall. This is what I meant, because some of you might still be confused about the setbacks and the abutments and the uses of them. Um, okay, so beyond the setbacks, you cannot build anything enclosed, a room, okay, so part of the house. But a carport is not enclosed, so it can make use of the setback. But since it's made use of the setback, so you have to put a firewall. Okay, so here are some restrictions. It should only be 3.2 meters and 1.5 meters should be closed. The rest can have that opening there. So some of you might even think that the setback, you cannot even use the setback for playgrounds or um, for landscaping. So I noticed that in some of the works, no? It's like the setback is it's like an extra land for future expansion, and there's nothing there. So that's wrong. No? The setback is simply the non-buildable part of the house, but the non-buildable to mean for the enclosed part of the house. Okay? If you want to um, use part of the property or even use the setbacks in one side. So you have to put a firewall, but you cannot have a firewall all throughout from front to rear, only 80% of that side. So this is for the medium density residential zones. For R3, you can have on both sides, and then you can even have one side and the rear, but you cannot have the three sides with a firewall. I think there's a very uh, mm, how do you say that? Uh, it became famous in the internet, no, when this actress or some celebrity built her house, saying that no need for an architect, but the house seems to take up almost all the parts of the property, front, sagad some property did, front, the side, and then the rear. So that was wrong. A lot of professionals actually pointed that out. Okay, so these are things that you should consider. I'm going to share these slides with you, and I hope you keep them so that you can use it for reference when you actually do not only your plate, but when you actually a professional and doing your projects. So development controls, this was actually discussed by Architect Tabasuaras for the first plate. And then this is actually in the National Building Code. Okay, so these are just graphics that can help you uh, understand the terms more. What is setback or what is footprint? Okay, so here what you need to know is that there's a maximum allowable maximum building footprint, and then you also have the total open space within the lot. So this one, so that's the footprint there, and then outside of that, along the setback is the open space within the lot. Now, in open space, part of it is paved and part of it is not paved, okay, or unpaved. So, and then there's a table here that tells you how much of the property should be paved and how much should not be paved. Paved means you cover it with cement, okay? Uh, so it becomes impervious. So when it rains, so no water can seep through the soil. So therefore, there should be a part of the property where water can still uh, seep through the soil so that it recharges the water table. Okay, here. Otherwise, it will flood. No? So the water will not be absorbed by the soil, so it will go somewhere else. It will go to the canal outside. But then when all of the houses are doing that, so the canal cannot take in the volume of water, so it floods. So it's important to follow these regulations. Okay, so there are many of them. And then there's also the building height limit to consider, and this applies even to the subdivision. Um, for R1, the meters above highest grade is 10 meters. You can actually go as high as three floors, but not beyond 10 meters, which means that your roof will have to be flat. Okay. Otherwise, you can have two floors, which is required by the project, by the plate, and then you can have the gable roof, for example, or hip roof. But to count the height of the building when using gable or hip roof, you establish it here in between the top of the ridge and then the uh, top of the roof beam. Okay, so divide that to two, and that's where you get your 10 meters from the established grade. Okay. The established grade is the soil, the grade line. Okay. If you have a if you have a paved area, so you normally have the soil and then maybe of 4 inches of concrete pavement. So the grade is the soil, not the top of the pavement. Now, in some areas, in some development, especially commercial developments and condominiums, so the height is restricted also by this. How do you call this? Angle or slope of angular plane for building structures. So with or without projections. So depending on the angle here given, no? If with projections, for example, so 50 degrees, if the road is 8 meters or 10 meters, so if it's 8 meters, so you have 50 degrees here. So your building should only be within that angle, from the horizontal, and it should not go beyond it. Okay, so that you can have, that's why some, if you notice, some buildings at the bottom, they are nearer the front, but then when they go up, so the building sort of goes, also recedes, no, the building line recedes in the top floors because they're trying to avoid this angle. So why, what is this for? It's actually to allow sunlight and air also to go through the streets. Okay, because the street is also like our, um, if it's an HVAC system, heating, ventilating, air conditioning system, so the street is like our duct systems. Okay, so the wind travels through it and then gets distributed. Okay, but in the first place, the wind has to be able to penetrate it, and also the sun. Um, Although it's good to have shades every now and then, but it's better if the shades are uh, something like temporary, so the street still gets some sun. Because other than having vegetations there, you also need to make it look safer, no? Otherwise, it becomes like a scene for Batman. Everything is always dark, and then there are a lot of criminals. So allowable maximum volume of building, and then that's it. Okay. So very good. Um, there are now like only 14 of you. Um, so starting next meeting, I'll be checking attendance. Okay. But it's not graded, so don't worry. I just wanted to see um, whether some of you are not really attending at all, because that's an indication of some problem. So in which case, uh, I'll have to I'll have to ask the person if there's any problem, and if we can help out. Um, the exam, midterm exam, there are still two students who have not taken the midterm exams, and I'm wondering what their plans are. If they are, so what I'm going to do is I will simply simply wait for them to ask me if they can take the exam, because I will open up the exam for them so that they can take it. Okay, but if they do not ask, so I will not open it to them. Okay, so there are two of you. I will not mention the names, but you know who you are. So other than that, I guess that's it for today. Do you have any questions? So I guess none. If you do have questions, just please send me an email or a note in Canvas or even in Google Classroom, wherever. It always reaches me. And that's it. So see you next meeting. I'll stop the recording.